offers is a done-for-you lead generation service that finds and nurtures leads in your chosen zip code and hands them straight to you, so you are the first agent they talk to. We do all the
Good afternoon. We're welcoming you back to our keynote for this afternoon and the discussions and sessions that follow. I have a couple of logistical announcements very quickly. The first is this session will end at 2:15. And we have paper sessions that are beginning immediately afterwards. What we have decided to do is to give a 10-minute, we've added a 10-minute break to the program. So the paper sessions, et cetera, will begin at 2:25. I will stand up, maybe perhaps at the beginning of questions, and remind anyone who's in the room who's a paper presenter that they need to get to their paper presentation room in a timely way. But there'll be a relatively brief window, and I apologize for that, to move between the rooms. Second, just a reminder that should you wish, we do have COVID tests, and we do have an ample supply of masks for people who are either want to wear a mask or otherwise are not feeling or feeling for some reason that it's appropriate. We remind you in particular our volunteers are interacting with a great number of people, and at least some of them feel, or at least some of them are benefit from when you're interacting, or when certain people are interacting, the other person having a mask might be a way of showing a bit of kindness to our volunteers. And then the third point, just to remind you of, as Michael Ekstrand mentioned this morning, the ACM FAccT Executive Committee has drafted a statement about harms and risks arising from AI. That's available on. It's been circulated by Twitter. It'll be available on the FAccT website. Do take a look and decide whether you would like to sign. Okay. So with those preliminaries out of the way, it's really my delight to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, Payal Arora. Dr. Arora is a professor, the chair in technology, values, and global media culture at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. She's the academic director of UX and inclusive design at the Erasmus Center for Data Analysis and is co-founder of FemLab, a feminist future of work initiative. Her brilliant earlier book, The Next Billion Users, Digital Life Beyond the West. This is her previous project, just to be clear, not what she's going to be talking about today. Discusses questions about how expectations of how the global poor should interact with technology in tandem with the history of institutional and financial arrangements that make technology available play out. She maps the multitude of dynamics placed upon the poor who play with the new tools and show how the poor, nonetheless, despite significant obstacles, continue to play and find forms of agency in new digital contexts. We're delighted to welcome her today to talk about feminist design principles for the future of global work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I must say, looking at the papers in the last few days, it is really exciting and heartening to see the range of topics around social justice issues and reforming tech, and I hope this talk can contribute to that effort. So, why feminist approaches to design? I mean, for starters, feminists have long been deeply engaged in the future of work. And, the first generation scholars were very preoccupied about pay equality as well as improving work conditions. But the most recent feminist scholars are all about disrupting the patriarchal regimes within which we are operating in, as well as sidelining neoliberal sort of practices, right? And instead putting at the center care, compassion, and empathy so we can have real equity for all. But what does that actually mean? How does that actually play out? This talk is going to sort of inform through lived experiences of the marginalized majority, and hopefully it'll head us in a more productive direction. So just briefly, I plan to cover the following, just explain a little more about my positionality, FemLab, obviously we don't build in a vacuum, so what's the inspirations, some of which like fair work principles, but why is that still limiting, and why do we need something called fem work principles? And basically how we can, let the lived experiences of the marginalized majority help guide us in that direction. And I will try to end in an optimistic note, which I really feel is really important in this age of pessimism, particularly talking about the projects and practices which we can learn from and hopefully engage, right? So, as Aziz brought up, I'm a digital anthropologist, and I've spent about 2 decades looking at how young people in marginalized communities make sense of digital media in their everyday lives. And I've spent a lot of time in low-income communities in India, informal settlements, as well as rural areas across India, and in recent years in Brazil amongst migrant communities and informal settlements, and later also in Namibia and rural areas. And so that sort of informed this book. But there was another pattern, a couple of patterns I saw, which is what has led me to this direction, is that a lot of young people who are using digital media were, of course, using it for self-actualization, connectivity, entertainment, the whole spectrum of emotional and physical well-being, but they were also deeply instrumentalizing it for livelihoods because their governments across the world were failing them in providing the kinds of jobs they saw themselves doing. So, I thought that was really interesting, and it says something if you look at the statistics on the creator economy, for example. Besides the US and the UK, the top 10 countries are all in the global south. Right? Brazil is one of the leaders in the creator economy. It's not a coincidence. Or who are adopting crypto, right? It's in the global south. A lot of global south youth, particularly between sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, are the future youth, and they are shaping the internet, particularly in the world of work, as the digital becomes more and more integrated into our everyday work lives, right? So we do need to look at that. But there was also another a deeply disturbing trend, which is basically in the last decade, we've seen a drop in women's participation in the workforce, despite the rise in economic progress. And this has a lot to do with social-cultural factors. On top of it, there's a double marginalization because in the last decade, we've seen a drop in women embracing the digital. In fact, some are abandoning all of the internet. We came out with a paper called, Good Girls Don't Get Online, in a sense because these spaces are considered not women-friendly due to the growing misogyny. So you put the two trends together, and that's not a happy, sort of future, and rather exclusionary future, right? So I partnered with my long-term collaborator, Usha Raman, who's a feminist media scholar in University of Hyderabad. And we set up something called FemLab, which is Feminist Future of Work Initiative. And we received seed funding from IDRC on a really exciting project, which was basically looking at low-income women workers across multiple sectors in India and Bangladesh. And we chose the non-sexy sectors, right? Salon services, garments, sanitation, construction. I mean, people don't look at these as much because they think it's not really tech-worthy, or it's lowbrow. It's at the bottom of the global supply chain. And yet these, we believe, are fundamental to the way in which we can reimagine the future of work, particularly looking at it through a cross-sector lens. And so we were looking at how they use digital media and platforms to, improve their work conditions. What are their concerns? What are their strategies? How do they organize themselves digitally and socially using these tools? And basically, how can this be integrated into their lives? And so obviously, this is a team effort, as all research is, and this is our team, and we are spread across the world. And I must say, FemLab emerged, it became a thing. It started off as a grant project, and then we got more seed money from UNHCR, Adobe, and a variety of other organizations. And so we became an organization partly because of the pandemic. Much of our research was happening during the pandemic, and as many of you know, many people were deeply affected, particularly in India, where, in the second wave, so many of our researchers lost many family members. We're not just talking one or two, sometimes like an entire set of families. And so it was devastating, and it brought us very close because we had to be empathetic. We had to basically, in praxis, implement the values we were touting for theory. So this is also a very interdisciplinary group. So we're talking about feminists, sociologists, anthropologists, legal scholars, and we build deeper partnerships for capacity building because, one of the things is really the fundamental part of feminism is to build solidarities across borders because diversity is scalable. And, so one of the aspects is, yes, we are looking at low-income women workers, but there's much, that can be transferred and empathized across. Like, for example, we work with Harambee in South Africa, which is about the youth movement, and they're doing amazing work with Black youth and how they are upskilling themselves and taking on leadership positions across African countries. We are working with Justice Adda, which is a design and legal firm, because one of the things FemLab does is 3 parts. We put the lived experiences of marginalized majority, at the center of informing us about policy and design. But the second part, which is equally important, is ensuring that we give value back to the people we are interviewing, the participants of our research. We're really pushing against the sort of legacy of, colonial roots of anthropology, where we are very extractive in nature. So we work with a lot of NGOs in sort of sharing our data and then going back and helping them to capacity build in their own organizations. So we've organized many events in India, Bangladesh, South Africa, and Brazil to do these kinds of efforts. So we know that it's a two-way process because data is value, right? And we need to give value back. And the third part is that we work with technology companies, people within who are invested in changing it from within, as well as other organizations and government actors. Because I think that's fundamental. We do need to cross-talk, and we need to have these sort of vibrant trade-offs and compromises if we want to move ahead together. So, all right, so we're not starting from scratch, and obviously there's really good work, and probably some of you in this room are already engaged in this work on Fair Work. And it's an organization started at Oxford, but it has its franchisees and a number of people involved in it across the world, and they're working closely with ILO, which is the International Labour Organization. And part of these is they develop principles on basically fair pay, work conditions, management, and representation, all good stuff, right? The problem is that we were, getting all this data about, listening to our participants, these women workers, and their stories did not fit this sort of tropes. A couple of things. So with fair pay, it's not about the gig economy that, an algorithmic injustice itself that should be the starting point of investigation. In fact, feminism has a lot to contribute because as long as women have been in the workforce, there's been inequality of pay. So we need to go back in time to understand there's such a rich history and weight that we can learn from that we can apply to the tech questions and not the other way around, right? So gig work itself is obviously at this point is deeply critiqued as a sort of term as if it's something on the side, when in reality, it is a majority of how majority form in which work takes place around the world, which is really informal economies, right? That makes up the majority of the world. We're talking about 60 to 80% of the world's economies are informal in nature, and women constitute a majority of that kind of informality and precarity. So, well, look at in terms of fair conditions then. A lot of emphasis in fair work is about, privacy and safety. But when we spoke to a number of women, like, for example, in the ride-hailing sector, women were mainly not going into the ride-hailing sector because there's a huge shortage of women drivers and a huge demand, right? And it's because there's not sufficient clean and safe resting places and toilets. So there's physical infrastructure that is needed, as well as upskilling in ways which are not condescending. And there's a whole list of reasons why women believe that what is good for them in terms of conditions are very distinctly about women's, concerns. And so there has to, again, be a feminist approach to that. In terms of management, this notion of, well, it's become sort of dehumanized because there has to be a human supervisor, and that's part of the fair work principle is you can't just be all technological. But many of the workers, whether in the Bangladesh factories, which are dominantly women-led, by the way, sometimes as high as 92% to 95%, said that they preferred anonymity and they preferred dealing with tech systems than with people because the male supervisors were deeply discriminatory and would dismiss them easily. But if they use the tech systems, there was a higher chance they'd be listened to. So so there's much more nuance here. And the last is about fair representation. And it's all good about unions, and absolutely we need more of that. But in many patriarchal contexts, which is the majority, again, of the world, it's dominated by upper caste or higher status males, and women are practically invisible. It's also not flexible, and women disproportionately carry care work, so it doesn't work around their schedules. So for a whole host of reasons, we found almost zero presence of women in these unions in India and Bangladesh and in many parts of Africa. So they were, in fact, doing much more informal collectivizing in ways which need to be captured. So these were the reasons why we felt, we need something more. We need something which is putting women's interests and other genders' interests at the center if we are to move this in a more equitable direction. So, it's interesting that, say, 5 years ago, I remember this PhD came up to me of mine and said, I want to do feminist work, but I'm afraid if I put feminist in my title, nobody's going to read it, nobody's going to cite it, And we've changed, it's just 5 years, and we are experiencing a feminist turn. Because if the tech industry, especially venture capital, sees value, it says something. And look, let's be fair on the rise of femtech, right? There's a lot of celebration for good reason. In fact, it's predicted to be a huge industry of 50 billion. And, even The Guardian, which tends to be more critical, is it's a source of good, and now female tech has become synonymous with feminist tech, right? And partly that's because, there's been such a glass ceiling. And finally, women are, who are tech innovators and entrepreneurs are managing to carve funding. Canva is a great case in point, right? But now there's this euphoria that, we women can actually be designing for women and it's by women, and we can break this glass ceiling. We can actually shift gears, and also femtech is fintech. So we need to ensure there's money that backs it up so it can be scalable and change people's lives. And the other celebrations about, the fact is that for the longest time, men have been the starting points of any kind of development and design. So actually, Rathnau Institute just came out with a report about, I think, a day ago, and about femtech, and it's an interesting read, by the way. And they talk about male as a starting point for data-driven insights, and of course, Perez's classic book about how male bodies have long represented humanity as a whole. So in this way, femtech is saying, look, we need to produce much more data which is about women, so women can learn about themselves, reflect, and help improve their lives, and medical research can improve, and a whole variety of reasons. But before we start over-celebrating, there are, of course, the obvious issues of an over-emphasis of reproductive data. So if you look at majority of companies under femtech, it's really about, reproductive health, and very closely tied to the deeply stereotypical notions of what constitutes as, female, right? And it's the entire spectrum of well-being. But also, of course, it's an under-emphasis of diverse genders and marginalized groups. So it's not really capturing all of that. And more importantly is, if you're not careful, then this could be weaponized against them and become a sort of biometric monitoring economy, reifying the sort of surveillance capitalism of Zuboff, right? So what is then a feminist approach which would counter these sort of issues would be, I would say, first shift the term from femtech to femwork, because tech is work, right? It actually, when we say tech is work, we're basically emphasizing that behind tech, there's a lot of collective, invisible, immaterial, and informal labor that goes into that, right? And so we ask different questions. We ask about the workers and not about solutionism, right? We also need to value diverse work forms, work times, and workplaces, work forms which are and not just like productive in an obvious sense about delivering a particular good or service, but also the affective, the emotive, psychological, labor that goes in. As the panel yesterday very well from the Amazon Turk workers actually really brought to light, the care work, right, needs to be valued and accounted for. Work times, women have long been, used to not having uninterrupted times, this clear work and leisure, labor and leisure boundaries, right? So we need to recognize that they have these sort of, work and leisure go hand in hand and it gets subsumed. And how do we then address that? And of course, workplace is about how the domestic, the home life, is just as much a place of work. And it's not in that sense of remote work, right, as we now come to be. I mean, this is a legacy from decades where women's domestic work is work, and it needs to be recognized, including in economic values. And the other is feminist approach is a decolonial approach in today's terms. Because if you really want to be inclusive, the majority is the normative, right? Because if we start to look at, okay, low-income women workers, and then you look at other marginalized groups, you will see there's a lot in common. There's a lot of solidarity that can be built. And if we see the spectrum of marginalization as this conference themselves, many of you have already contributed in a very rich and nuanced way. Actually, we do make up that majority, and if we put that at the center, then we are informing that tiny little elite group that seems to still dictate the imagination of the future of work. And last but not least is we need to get past this sort of binary, because when we talk about replacement or either or, it's really taking our precious efforts and moving it into directions that are not conducive, because it's both. The question is really about relationality and not about which one. Which is it? Is it paperless or is it digital? They often are both. Is it a user or non-user? No, you can actually be someone who's in a family and there's one mobile phone and multiple people are contributing to the way in which that digital tool is used, right? Or if it's individual or collective, it's not, you can be an individual and be part of a collective. In fact, your individual well-being can be very tied to that collective well-being, right? It's synonymous, right? Or flexibility in the future of work, especially with disruptive technologies like generative media, we're going to see more and more that people do value flexibility and do value this notion of freedom of choice. We shouldn't be pegged to a employer, for instance, right? But we do need a strong safety net that needs to be built to allow us to experiment with new technologies, allow us to upskill, allow us to rediscover what human capacities are to leverage on these new opportunities. So that actually allows us, and that needs to be formalized, right? And so, leisure and labor, the classic paradigm, which one is it? Labor can be deeply, leisure-oriented if you are, passionate, and it is something which is, whether you're in a gaming community, that's a lot of labor, right? But also, leisure can be deeply laborious, and, you could be working in a factory, doing gaming, but being, extremely exploited. So, and then, of course, care and efficiency. Care can be deeply efficient because it's more sustainable, with the burnouts across board and, and the mental health that it takes, the toll it takes on mental health, it is more efficient long-term to be more care-worthy and personal and professional. And I'll illustrate this more by concrete examples. So FemWork is supporting the right to 5 areas of right to access, plural identities, dignity, refusal, and professional development. So here's some concrete cases from from our field work, which brings this to life. Now, Meesho is a reseller platform in India, and they're scaling across the global south. And we've spoken about this double marginalization, right, about gender divide and digital divide. So a number of people at the Meesho platform said that we needed to approach not the woman, to work, but the family as a unit. And this we heard across different sectors. If you want a woman to come to your workplace, you need to speak to her family, where you need to speak to her, the father-in-law, the husband. And this is the reality of the patriarchal systems. And one could feel very, depressed about this aspect. But this is the sort of pragmatic approach for design companies. So they really wooed the family as a unit to convince them it would be good for the entire family well-being. But in this makeup, right, because they recognize that off-app business activities are really deeply tied to in-app activities. So yet, when we look into what's happening, there is a quiet feminism, because as these women start to work and stay on, they build confidence, they gain respect within the household, they get a say within it, and they quietly shift the care work, some of it onto other family members as they build the agency. And so that was actually very interesting to see. And the other very interesting thing was about how they were able to access leisure through professionalism of labor, because they're given their own work phone. Many women across the global south are given mobile phones by their families, whether it's their husbands or their fathers, and they are tracked. They're not allowed to have passwords. They're constantly watched. They can always be checked on, right? And so they are even told explicitly that we are putting on tracking technologies, right? And that's a very legitimate thing to do. But because it's all about them upholding the family values, including community or village values. So there's a lot of burden on women. But on the other hand, when it comes to professionalism, the workplace gives you the mobile phone, and they get on these sort of feedback grievance platforms, and that's where they start to experience more leisure. So professionalism becomes a pathway to leisure, and that allows for self-actualization and discovery, which is fundamental to human beings. So the right to plural identity is a good case in point as a construction sector. So in the thick of our fieldwork, we were in the second wave of the pandemic in India. And as many of you know, millions of people, migrants, were moving to the villages. And that was really shocking, because the last time something of that kind of magnitude happened was in the partition between India and Pakistan. And so, this also made visible the enormity of how the urban systems were being upheld by migrant workers from rural areas. But what was interesting was the government was actually quick to respond and created this very, efficient fintech system, which is now called the tech stack, the largest public digital infrastructures in the world. So it was commendable, and they were saying we could directly send you payments into your, mobile account. But 94% of the construction workers did not take on that payment. That was an astounding number. So you're like, how is that possible? What's going on? And the reason is because they're allowed to have one identity. And there's this assumption that when you move from the rural to the urban, you've given up your rural life. But actually, that's not the reality. Across the global south, and actually this is prescient across the world, is that we should be able to have multiple work identities, right? Because farming is a seasonal activity. And many of the countries are still very agricultural in nature. So when you're in off-season, you come into the city to boost your income, and it's also diversifying your risk. So you're also working for Ola or Uber, and you're also cleaning homes. You're doing multiple things, but you cannot let go of the farmer identity because it's tied to subsidies. So you choose to be a farmer on paper, which means you can't access the identity of a construction worker. So we need to recognize this is the nature of work in majority of the world if we are to get past and make systems work for people, right? And this ties to this notion of also politics of recognition, which also feeds into the politics of categorization, right? So there's this objective identity, and then there's, of course, a subjective sense of identity. But what's interesting is even the objective is sort of pliable. For example, genders is a classic case in point. And the other is also age, something as banal as age. Most people speak in approximates about what they age. I must be between 60 to 70, right? I mean, so if you go across a lot of parts of the global south, they don't give you an exact age. And also there's this politics of difference and universalism, in a sense that, yes, you can actually emphasize the difference and basically, yes, these are construction workers, these are farmers, but there needs to be a sort of centralized effort to, create interoperability of these identities to allow them to move across borders so they can, capitalize and sustain themselves, right? So, and I mean when I say universalism, not in a flattened kind of sense, because it evokes a sort of flattening perspective, but more in terms of solidarities across borders. So, some good examples of recognition or non-recognition in that case. So, for example, a non-recognition is in the artisanal sector, where most women refuse to call themselves as a worker. They did not see themselves as a worker. So we are like, but you are working. You've literally been doing this bangle making for 7 hours or 8 hours straight. But they're like, no, we're just helping out because they're in their homes, they're taking care of their children, they're cooking while they're doing the bangle work. And so they don't recognize. Now, if they don't state themselves as a worker, they can't enjoy the rights or benefits or unionizing or any of those which is offered in the artisanal sector. So the other is about misrecognition. There's a lot of corporate entities, repositioning them as, for example, salon services, any of the gig platforms as partners. But of course, the partners evokes a sort of equality and a sort of a, back and forth relationship, which is not true. It's a very top-down relationship. So it can actually skew the way in which we perceive our roles in a workplace and the under-recognition of migrant workers, as I explained. The right to dignity is an interesting case. Like, for example, we've been looking at a lot of surveillance technologies entering the workplace, particularly remote work, but there's much more granularity which happens all the way to the bottom of the supply chain, which is basically, for example, even the humblest of the sanitation workers, which has, which often gets ignored. There was a lot of initiatives on how to track them by making them wear GPS watches. So their moves can be tracked, and also if they were not in the designated areas, their pay would be docked. But women complained how their bangles would impact it was simple things like that. The bangles were interfering and would switch off the watch, and then they wouldn't get paid. And a variety of reasons. They also felt it was very intrusive, right? And the other example is in the retail sector, where the cameras are put in many shops where, workers are not allowed to sit because it doesn't look professional. So they stand for 10 hours sometimes a day. And so both actually had, this is a nice story, is that they actually collectivized, and a lot of these women went to the streets, the right to sit. They actually put a chair on their head and they walked across the street. And this was in Kerala, state in the south of India, and with the sanitation workers, also they protested against it, and the government moved back and actually made it voluntary. And also for the right to sit, they started to emphasize that this should be a possibility. And so this is what I mean. It's like these are really humble but very essential ways of dignity, right, in our everyday life. So. And the cross-sectoral sort of discrimination, there is definitely a layer of caste-based, because a majority of these workers are, from lower castes and tribes, and that's really a sort of a intersectionality of multiple marginalizations that get amplified, and many of them reported as feeling like, iron shackles around their neck. The right to refusal, so in the ride-hailing sector, for example, a number of women workers protested that is so customer-centric, but it also needs to be worker-centric. So they have to have a right to also assess their clients, but more importantly, the company needs to take that assessment seriously so they can block their participation on the portals. And there has to be a transparency of what does it take for a company to make that initiative, right? So because a lot of harassment, they didn't feel safe in the nights, and so there had to be that kind of power. And, the other is on focusing, and I mentioned about the toilets and resting stations, which actually was one of the key reasons why they did not go into this area of, right, even though there was a lot of opportunity, there's a huge scarcity, and they were increasing the pay because they wanted women to work as drivers, because there's a demand not just for other women, because women and public space have long been, a problem that because in patriarchal societies, because engaging with strangers and taking ownership of public space is considered threatening to the patriarchal order. So you can imagine a job that makes you move through a public space, interacting with strangers can be deeply threatening. And so the other thing was very, very interesting. In the last few years, there's been a rise of feminist taxi organizations like Taxi, a variety of in India, and a number of these CEOs said that they did not intend to scale. Because they felt like the amount of effort, if you want to do good, and you can be sustainable, it is quite laborious because women needed to be upskilled. You had to invest in these workers for 6 months because it was simple things like they had no confidence in handling a car. They didn't feel that they were capable of anything. So you had to really boost their confidence. Simple things like how do you open a door? Which doesn't quite come to your imagination, but that's something that, can you do it with confidence? Could you say the right greetings, And so all these little details that went into the upskilling effort, which is not just technological, right? And so they felt like since it was so laborious and it was all about building themselves in the community and creating this sort of teaching them about banking, literacy. So it was a larger project. It was not scalable, and it was fine. So we assumed that success equals scalability, and a number of them contested that. But what was interesting was that they also saw a problem because the way in which their models were sustainable, these feminist taxi services, was that they would be contracted with, say, a number of these gated communities, where, or these work parks, right? International work parks and zones where a lot of multinationals would come in. And for virtue signaling many ways, a lot of multinationals would hire and work with these she taxis and other kinds of feminist taxis. But they would also request on the phone, we want a slim, pretty girl, a Hindu, upper caste, and a whole range of criteria where if it was through an algorithmic system and there was no sort of options, it would nudge them into understanding that this is not an acceptable request. So you can see that there is a benefit, and many of the female drivers said they preferred that way driving for Ola, Uber, because customers didn't have that choice, and by default they treated them as a professional, versus these gated communities felt they owned them, right? So you can see quite a sort of nuanced and messy business. And the last is the right to professional development. So in Bangladesh, during the pandemic, there was an urgency to upskill the factories and automate with the latest technologies. But a lot of the supervisors were very excited, and they were telling the women who, as I mentioned, something like 90 to 95% are driven by women in Bangladesh. It is their main economy. Garment industry is a massive economy. And they told the women that now, finally, your son can work here instead of you, right? So because we've now automated and now you need higher skills. So rather than investing in these women who've been working there for years, right? So in part of the future work imaginary is as things become more technological, do we see women and other marginalized groups as part of that imaginary? And that itself is an obstacle in shaping these systems, right? So this is a sort of framework we've come up with in terms of FEM work, which is where FAIR is about compensation, attribution, and effort, and E is for equitable, basically recognizing the sort of intersections of marginality, and M is about mobility enhancing. There has to be some sort of pathway to reasonable opportunities for meaningful engagement, the worker, W is for worker identity focus, about plural identities, and the opportunity to organize in a creative way, which besides just the formality of unions, which I've explained is rather restrictive, respect-based, where it's not a transaction of oppression, but of mutual need and gain. And last but not least is the K of a knowledge-based, which reflexively draws on multiple knowledge and stakeholder perspectives. So just to wrap up here, I'm missing on the time. How much time do I have? So Okay, so yeah, so just feminist praxis. So as I mentioned, we are working with Justice Adda, which is a design and legal for organization and NGO in Delhi, and we're creating these media literacy toolkits. Basically for the workers and to explain about their rights, giving them in ways which are using animations, also in multiple languages, not in English, on WhatsApp groups, and we also bring them physically together. Another sort of praxis project I'm involved with is actually led by Chato here, somewhere in this room, and it is a Horizon-funded project, and it's a 5-year project where we're working with stakeholders across Europe to take on a feminist and intersectional approach to building, to reducing discrimination AI recruitment systems. And part of the way in which we're doing this is to, create semi-synthetic data sets. And I want to underline the semi part of the synthetic data sets, which requires us to engage with marginalized communities. And in fact, in the next day or so, we are basically going to let out a campaign on social media, and I hope some of you could help out, to basically recruit CVs, people to contribute their CVs to this sort of data donation campaign, so we can build the sort of more equitable data sets to shape these recruitment systems. Because in the end, discrimination does not just stay at the level of obviously algorithms, but obviously the data sets, which is basically garbage in is garbage out. So if we can fix to some extent that problem, or at least reshape that, then there's a hope that we can reduce bias, right? So yeah, so I will share that link about the data donation campaign. And the last project I'm involved with is with Laura Herman, and she's at Oxford as well as at Adobe, and she's going to be leading on the AI efforts at Adobe, but also we're bringing in Whose Knowledge, Flickr, and a number of us. The notion is that we need to diversify the Creative Commons and working with artists, and not just about how people want to be represented, but not about their current realities, but also about their aspirational realities, right? So artists are a great collaborator, like the Bolivian artist. We are working with Ecuadorian artists, as well as a wonderful movement from Whose Knowledge, which is about the visible wiki women. So yes, if anyone's working in these spaces, please connect, engage. Would love to hear more. And so last but not least, key takeaways. We need to focus on redressal mechanisms over the sort of ideal services and products, because there is no such thing as an ideal, perfect product. Because even when you make the best, it's going to change because they are living sort of social actors, like inherently. So it has to be about independent auditing systems as well as redressal mechanisms that will keep us in line, right? Because it's a continued effort. I mean, then we need to broaden the user paradigm, because if we start to account for non-users, intermittent users, indirect, collective, that's the marginalized majority also. So that we need to rethink the user paradigm. The intermediaries are here to stay, so we need to stop thinking about either or, as I mentioned, but realizing that we always will need intermediaries as long as humankind exists. The question is the relationality, right? And as I mentioned, care is efficiency made sustainable. And the last is, the feminist sort of ethos about the personal is political is now in the global south particularly emphasizes how the professional is personal. And with that, I will stop, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
of a war. So it's definitely an upgrade, not to, but still, there's some common ground, and how could some international institutions should be thinking about this. And just for the record, a disclaimer, right? I do not speak for the World Bank in any way, shape, or form. And yeah, thank you.
So I think I understood some of it because there was a lot of echo with the mic, maybe. So, but either way, if I'm correct in what you were asking, it was like, how do we create these sort of global data sets which are equitable? How do we create solidarities across nations where governments and other stakeholders can participate in a sort of meaningful sense? Am I correct? Or do I get? Okay, great. And yeah. Yeah, so I mean, so one of the things is to recognize that, and this feeding off also from and resonating with other keynote talks also that mentioned about how we need to cross-talk, right? Because right now I feel like there's a lot of polarities about, well, we are against the platforms, we're against companies, about the government, but actually there's even in, so-called authoritarian regimes, there are good people working in the state in the state governments. And usually we focus so much on the federal level that we don't go down to the humbler levels of government, which is often at a municipality level, which is the best way we notice to create change, because you don't get noticed as much. And there's a lot of good people working still, and you just have to resonate and act with it, because that's the only ways to, so a couple of ways. One is to identify, good people across sectors, state, corporate, as well as civic society, because that's the way we can proceed forward. And you need to not do it in a loud, sort of in-your-face way. It has to be incremental and soft and subtle, because that's the kind of activism happening at many of the ground realities. And one of the ways in which I'm able to operate in these kinds of spaces is also because you allow people to take credit. So you need to put your ego aside and come up with a successful sort of product or service which allows for people to be incorporated, but allow, say, some minister to get the credit, right? And so you have to play the politics of it, and because in the end goal is the most important. The other is the kind of framings. So I worked on a project on data health in the Himalayas with Siemens, and what they did was there was a sort of a diagnostic software which is designed in a laboratory along with the sort of clustering and categorizations already pre-existing on healthcare, right? And then they brought it to India. And so majority of people did not resonate and articulate their health conditions in the ways in which it was categorized. So they could not actually use those applications. So it's not just about data sets, it's the way in which you organize and make meaning and understand the way people articulate is so socio-culturally and linguistically, shaped. And so, and there's a whole variety, like, giving weight to language, and incorporating in all these dimensions that can allow us to be pretty optimistic. But I'll stop there because it's a big question, but it's at least a starting point, Thank you. No.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm very interested in these questions of global distributive justice and technology, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the kind of, I guess I'm interested in whether you believe there is like a human right to be included in these kind of technological advances. I wasn't sure from your talk whether there was a kind of active demand or like a political mobilization to try and claim back some of the wealth that technology's enabled, or whether people who you've worked with have a kind of ambiguous attitude to this whole kind of set of developments. So yeah, if you could speak to that, it would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, thank you for the question. And so again, I think maybe I'm a little deaf because everything's echoing, or has other people experienced it? But again, I'll just to reiterate, like, are you talking about like how are the rights movements in these contexts like playing out, and how are the participants or the people who are the recipients of these changes are responding to these rights? Is that right? Okay. Wow. Okay, thank you. So yeah, so I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, in fact, you saw how we put forward the right to refusal, right? You know, there's a reason we put that in, because we are at a point in time where anything universal, anything cutting across borders is looked upon in a negative light, because for good reason, right? Universality has long been long translated to basically a flattening of cultures, people, marginalizations. And so people have reached this point where even this rights-based approach seems to, from the sort of Washington consensus kind of ethos, post-colonial, apparatus. But there's still a reason why we need to pay heed to that, because that's what solidarity is about. And that's why I emphasize that you can be, reflexively universalistic while paying heed to diversity. Because, like a case in point is, we were working with disability groups in India, and one of them is saying that, well, actually everybody is, we are constantly looked upon as a niche, and people say, oh, that's not sustainable to build, rights is all like a privilege of the West, they don't understand that in these resource-constrained times, young entrepreneurs, how are we supposed to cater to these, right? But disability groups are saying that actually everyone at some point in time are going to be disabled if we look broaden that definition. The elderly, everyone's going to have some kind of health issues. There's mental health, but also there's this easier way of, maybe like for example, a phone. You can be a one-armed person and you can only use a phone, or you would be a mother who's holding groceries, your child, and also has one arm. So you have to imagine the context within which you would be in that position, right? Versus looking at them purely in terms of identity and the conditions that generate these sort of states. And so in that regard, then you are incorporating pretty much the majority of the world. And so it has meaning. So we, again, and this is why there's a pushback and this notion of why we should take on a feminist approach, is because we will start to think in relational terms, that we don't need to make that sort of binary choice. And I think we need to revive this notion that we do need universalisms of a sort of productive kind, because we are going into this hyper-localism. Including in Amsterdam, I see, go local, particularly post-pandemic, and the the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And people are like, well, global is not a good thing, being global. But the biggest issues and challenges we face today are intrinsically demanding a global approach, whether it's a climate crisis, whether it's fiscal reform, it's inequalities. And so, we have to think in global terms. We have to think in rights-based approaches for us to get anywhere, right? So, but it's sad that I have to make that case, because I think it needs to be revived. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I appreciated how you gave examples both of kind of feminist products, like you talked about FemTech, as well as feminist processes and supporting workers. And I was curious if you had examples of something I guess I struggle with, is how do you use feminist processes to develop feminist products or artifacts? So I guess the feminist taxis is a nice example of that. But are there other examples you've come across of that transition from process into actually producing a feminist technology?
So what are some of the examples of feminist technologies, right? Like where these values are embedding, right?
Yeah, that the values are embedded both in the end product, but also in the process. Because I think a lot of the ways that capital supports the development of technology now is kind of non-feminist.
Mm-hmm. So basically, thank you. So basically, in one hand, like this femtech, there is I think, for example, we can differentiate on when femtech is truly feminist, and it's not just like, well, we are targeting a female group, right?
Exactly.
And where you pay heed to ask questions like, where's this data going, for instance? So it could be on a very banal level of, yes, it's good to know. It's not good to know and track your menstrual cycles. Sure, it gives us much more agency, right? But is that going in share, and is it being shared across third parties that is going to, indirectly or directly impact me or me as a collective down the line? Is it going to shape policies which are going to be detrimental to me? And also today in the US context, of course, abortions, that's really sensitive data. In fact, there's this whole movement of delete all healthcare apps that you have, because that's going to somehow, especially to do the female body, because it's going to bounce back and it's going to harm you. So this kind of solidarity in the US of we should not have these reproductive apps or any of them, right? So I think that's at a level, it's nothing to do with even design. It's about data sharing and the implications. So that's at one level. The other is about, like I mentioned, about the disability groups, about, it could be simple as a ramp. I mean, so it could be low tech, right? Like when you're in a wheelchair and you have a ramp, right? Others can also use. So can you create technologies where you put the niche at the center, but it can be repurposed for all, and it doesn't harm the others, but it actually brings us up in a sort of a higher civil, makes us much more civilized, right? So I think that's a sort of rethinking of that. And there's a number of good examples, like when I went to some schools in rural India, they even repurposed it as something which is playful. Like, for example, classrooms had slides where you can slide down, and kids really loved that, right? So there was, so there's all kinds of ways in which we can resell that ethos, and not just in ways that can engage and can be recontextualized. So that could be on a design level, but it's also on a policy level. So it cuts across board, right? Which also puts at the heart of the question, like, what is innovation? And innovation is not just technologically centered. It is shaped by good policy, who are the actors involved, and to much more banal reasons, which makes it then feminist, in the boringness of the details, right? So, thank you.
I want to close by thanking Payal for a wonderful keynote.
Thank you.